Hello, thanks for joining me. I am Liane Jackson, Senior Law Editor at Forbes, and today I'm joined by our legal analyst, Professor Claire Finkelstein from the University of Pennsylvania Carey School of Law, where she runs the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. She is a specialist in national security law, ethics, as well as democracy, and among other skills and specializations. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me again, Liane.
It is a monumental night. It is a potentially historic night. I know you've been closely following everything election related. You've been following everything Donald Trump related because there have been a lot of lawsuits, of course, all of his criminal cases, his civil cases, those sorts of things we've talked before. I want to talk to you a little bit first, though, about what's going on, the election, of course, but voting rights and alleged voter suppression and election integrity issues, efforts involving that. Of course, you mentioned to me a little bit earlier there were some bomb threats called in. They're not sure from whom in some jurisdictions. And how has all of this played into efforts to either get out the vote or to sort of rein in the number of people can vote until, from the Republican side, they feel like there's integrity issues here. People are voting who shouldn't be voting. We've got to tamp down on this. How has all of this played into both sides' strategies?
Well, that's a great question, Liane. And you'll remember that in the 2020 election, the Justice Department and officials concluded, against the judgment of Donald Trump, of course, that the 2020 election was the most secure that the United States had ever had. There are always problems in elections. There were always difficulties, from problems with voting machines to mistakes that people make in mailing in their mail-in ballots. But when we talk about security issues, we're not talking about minor glitches with filling in ballots, counting ballots, the sort of thing that happens when you're processing such large amounts of information. Election security and election fraud issues have to do with people really intentionally trying to skew the vote and succeeding at it on a large scale. And what officials concluded in 2020, you'll remember, is that that did not happen. And it's important to remember that as we go into this election, a cycle, and as the votes are being counted, because the fact that votes take a while to count doesn't mean that something has gone wrong or that something suspicious is going on. Now, you mentioned the bomb threats. Well, there is something suspicious going on there. And the Secretary of State of Georgia today, Brad Raffensperger, said that there had been bomb threats that were judged to be non-credible. So there was no bomb actually in the offing, but there was a false bomb threat in Georgia. There was another one in Maine, possibly in a third state. And Brad Raffensperger said that it is suspected that that was the work of the Russians. Now, this would not be entirely surprising because, as we know, the Russians made a big attempt in 2016 to interfere with our election. Our election system is our critical infrastructure, one piece of our critical infrastructure, and it really benefits the Russians to interfere with that. And malign foreign actors will always attempt to interfere with US critical infrastructure. But we have to be robust in our security systems in dealing with that kind of threat. And I think that it's impressive that US officials were able to call that out as Russian sourced so quickly, if indeed that does pan out.
Well, it's really interesting. Of course, there's foreign actors that can be involved. There's all sorts of bots or bad actors who coming from who knows where. But how important is it for a party or a candidate, if they so wanted, to sow the seeds of doubt about the integrity of our election system? Because that's what happened in 2020, and people still believe that the election, that Donald Trump won the election, despite the fact that it's been disproven by even Republicans have said that, Republican secretaries of state, those who are in charge of election systems, that there was no fraud in the voting system. But sowing the seeds of doubt and undermining institutions, whether it is the election integrity of the election machines themselves, whether it's the media, it's the reporting, things like that. Is this a playbook, and how important has it been in this election?
Forget that Donald Trump has been indicted in Georgia, among other things, for calling Brad Raffensperger and demanding that he come up with an additional almost 12,000 more votes in order to push Donald Trump over the finish line in Georgia, which Secretary Raffensperger resisted and rejected. And that is a form of domestic election interference if those allegations prove correct. That trial, obviously, if Donald Trump wins the election, we'll see what happens to those trials, and we could talk about that. But um, election interference is always a risk, whether it's from foreign or domestic actors. We hope that the parties won't behave that way. And we hope that they won't cry foul when no foul exists. It's a very damaging thing for our republic. You'll remember also that following the 2020 election, the Trump campaign filed over 60 lawsuits in federal and state courts to challenge the results of the election. And as you mentioned, a large proportion of the US population believes that, in fact, he was the rightful heir to that election, the rightful winner of that election. About a quarter of the US population apparently went into this election believing that the last election was stolen. And I think that is an important stage setting for a risk that people will be prepared to believe conspiracy theories in this election. And so it's critical that we find a way to restore faith in the elections, because they're really extremely secure at this point. And I think that US, both federal and state officials, are doing everything they can to ensure that there is no cheating in the elections.
And there has been multiple reports that any type of aberration in voting is usually extremely rare. That the United States, as you said, has one of the securest voting mechanisms in the world, and they are going out of their way to try to reassure the public. However, of course, we saw the January 6th insurrection that Trump is now being implicated in some federal cases about. But I wanted to ask you, related to that, is that something that we could see again? I mean, the DOJ cracked down in a major way on a lot of the participants. They gave pretty stern sentences. It's been playing out for years. Do you think that there's any risk that if Donald Trump were not to win this election, that his supporters who believe that would believe it was stolen again, and that something violence could ensue again?
Yeah, absolutely. And Trump has already said, in fact, that he will accept the results of the election if he wins, which means that if he doesn't win the election, he's implied he will not accept the results. And that's not what an election is about, of course. An election is about accepting the results, win or lose. Um, they are, from all reports, preparing that if Donald Trump does lose the election, that they will be filing lawsuits again. And it's a little bit curious because the last round of lawsuits on the election did not avail Donald Trump at all, since he lost all 60 of those actions. So why file them? So I think that this is a form in and of itself of disinformation, namely that when you file these complicated legal briefs that non-lawyers have trouble understanding and non-election specialists, and a court is willing to take it seriously and is willing to have entertained motions and have oral arguments on a case, it looks as though it's closer than it is. Which is why it's very important to, if you were the cases involving Rule 11 sanctions, where lawyers have been actually sanctioned for filing frivolous lawsuits, where there is no real colorable claim of the charges that they're making about fraud in the elections, or a basis for rejecting the results of the election. Courts ought to be very quick to sanction lawyers for doing that, and to say, look, don't waste the court's time and the public's money, because courts are supported by taxpayer dollars. Um, And judges are very often shy about using Rule 11 and using sanctions. It is a profound shame that the Trump trials did not complete and lay to rest the allegations in one direction or another, the indictments pending against Donald Trump, particularly for his conduct in the 2020 election. The classified documents matter is separate, but it is a shame that the January 6th case, which is a federal case, and the Georgia case involving the Georgia election, that those trials did not get completed before we went into this election cycle, because it would have been really important for people to know, did a court and did a jury decide that in fact he committed those offenses or not? And even if the verdict would have been a not guilty, maybe especially in the face of a not guilty verdict, it would have been important for people to have a resolution on that before they went to the polls.
Yeah, there was a lot of delay, of course, in the case in court, in federal court in Florida, and of course, Special Counsel Jack Smith's case as well. A lot of these were Trump-appointed judges that are involved in his cases. What are your observations or thoughts on the fact that, from his time in the White House, when he was able to appoint a number of federal judges, of course, and the Supreme Court, several on the Supreme Court as well, what not just within the United States and observers, like the rule of law, like where we are with the rule of law, where we could be going forward with the rule of law, if these sorts of issues persist. And we talked a little bit about also undermining sort of the media, like the fake news, the idea that you're not that they're not reporting correctly. That we talked about, you and I had discussed a little bit earlier, the 60 Minutes, a lawsuit against CBS and 60 Minutes for, speaking of law, maybe potentially frivolous lawsuits, a lawsuit against 60 Minutes for not showing for editing the interview they had with Vice President Kamala Harris. So attacking the media, attacking the rule of law, appointing judges that are sympathetic to your cause. What does this portend?
So my center, the Center for Ethics, yeah. So the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, of which I'm the faculty director, filed an amicus brief in the January 6th immunity case, and to address particularly the rule of law impact of immunity on the country, and in particular on the U.S. military. That's another topic, but I think it's extremely important to understand the impact of the immunity ruling on the rule of law in this country, because what that case said, what the Supreme Court said, was that it is almost logically impossible for the president to commit a crime if he was acting in his official capacity. So, like Richard Nixon said famously in the Frost interviews, if the president does it, it's not a crime. Now, that is not what we have assumed. We have not assumed that Nixon was correct on that. And it's been assumed on the contrary, that no person is above the law. As Chief Justice Roberts said, just 4 years ago in the 2020 case of Trump v. Vance, in which a similar issue relating to immunity came up, and how far the court has come since that earlier immunity decision. But presidents are not kings, and the assumption has been that presidents are not above the law, and that in fact they can be sued while in office, just as Bill Clinton was sued in the Paula Jones matter. They can be criminally investigated, and even if they can't, according to Justice Department policy, actually be tried, indicted and tried, it can be thoroughly investigated so that when they leave office, they can be tried for any crimes they commit. But now the Supreme Court has said that, in fact, if they're acting in their official capacity, they can't be deemed to have committed a crime because they have immunity. And that is a huge game changer. Now, in a very conservative court, in which Donald Trump appointed three of its current members, the court appeared to really bend over backwards. And this is a court that has a lot of ethics problems of its own. We've seen huge problems with Justice Thomas and Justice Alito in terms of their personal finances, their personal ethics, recusal rules, because the Supreme Court makes and enforces its own ethics rules, and there was no outside enforcer. That needs reform, that has to change, and we're seeing the results of the fact that we don't have that reform in place um, for in decisions like the immunity decision.
Yeah, a lot of democratic pillars that the country has gotten used to have been shaken and need to be, if I may mix my metaphors, we need to rewrite the ship. A lot of observers say in different ways, including, like as you mentioned, Supreme Court ethics reform, a de minimis level of ethics reform for the Supreme Court. But what do you, so just to kind of wrap up, if there's anything I haven't asked you about this that you think that's important in terms of what we can expect in terms of legal challenges or what you think could happen, I'd be interested in your predictions or what your thoughts are on that.
So, first of all, with regard to the trials, even though I have argued and recently published an article with my co author, Richard Painter, on the fate of the Trump trials if Trump is, in fact, victorious after today's election, um, that the trials ought to continue, that legally they can continue, that the prohibition from the Justice Department on indicting a sitting president is not at all the same as continuing an ongoing trial of a previously indicted individual who becomes president. And we think it's very important to mark that distinction. But in point of fact, what we can expect, and this is a direct threat to the rule of law, is that Donald Trump will fire Jack Smith, the special counsel, use his presidential powers, for example, his pardon power, to dangle pardons in front of those who assist him in achieving immunity and threaten to prosecute those who resist or refuse to assist him in his bid to protect himself against legal charges. Um, and that's really the stuff of dictatorship. When you can't hold the person at the top accountable, it's extremely dangerous for the country and it's a direct assault on the rule of law. So even if it's legal to continue the trials, I expect that we won't see any trials. Now, whether the actions that he would take to protect himself against the completion of those criminal trials might be judged to be obstruction of justice is another question. But who, in the midst of a Trump administration, is going to charge and try to try him for obstruction of justice when that very obstruction would have gotten rid of the trials that he is facing? So I think, in point of fact, the risk to the rule of law from a Trump presidency is very grave, and it's why it's so important to resolve pending legal matters before an individual gets to the White House, something we didn't have the ability to do. With regard to election security, um, it's really a shame that some of the reforms that were put in place and some of the money that Congress voted to improve state by state election security was rejected by the states. That money is probably still available, and probably Congress will be very quick to vote new election security funds. It's really critical that states be induced or be forced by Congress to revamp their those aspects of their elections where there are security issues. Well, on the whole, we do very well. It's important to remember that we don't really have one presidential election. We have 50 presidential elections because each state runs its own election. And what's so critical, I think, to rationalize our system and to protect it against accusations of fraud and to restore faith in the voting system is that we have common security measures that are clear, easy to understand, and that the public can rely on. and that the federal government can enforce if need be. And that calls for some voting reform legislation at the federal level.
As always, thank you so much for your insightful analysis on a wide range of issues. In this case, of course, election security, what's going to potentially happen with the legal challenges that Mr. Trump faces, and just the rule of law generally speaking. And of course, on this night where we are waiting for results any minute, any hour by hour, I should say, and we'll see how long that takes to play out, whether there are legal challenges that could potentially hamper those efforts. But I really appreciate you joining us at this time of the evening, and I look forward to speaking with you again, as always, Professor Finkelstein.
Thanks, Liane.